Today we're celebrating Valentine with a talk by Dr. Pascal Hand about reflections of love in Hafiz's poetry. Pascal has just finished writing an article about the famous Persian poet's outlook on Sufism and his spirituality. Dr. Pascal Hand is assistant professor at the Department of Arab and Islamic Civilizations. His research focuses on Islamic mysticism and the history of the medieval Iranian world. He has a PhD from the University of Chicago with a dissertation titled The Hanbali School and Mysticism in 6th-12th century Baghdad, which explores the relation between the Hanbali school and Islamic mysticism, as well as alternative approaches to Islamic mysticism. Today, Pascal will talk about Hafiz's general outlook on love, some of the main characteristics and imagery related to love in his poems, and how his ideas regarding love fit into the broader context of medieval scholarship and literature about love. So, before beginning, please help yourselves. There are refreshments at the back of the room, and please don't forget to shut off your mobile phones. Mobile phones. Okay, so without further ado, please, Pascal, I give you the floor.
Thank you, Dina. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about reflections of love in Hafiz's poetry. Let's start with a bit of background information on the author himself, Hafiz. His name is Shamsuddin Muhammad, but of course he's primarily known as Hafiz, which is his pen name, and according to most people refers to somebody who has memorized the Quran. We know, however, very little about Hafiz and his life. Otherwise, most people assume that he was born in the early 14th century between 1317 and 1325, and that he passed away either in 1389 or 1390. He lived most of his life, or probably all of his life, in Shiraz, a town in southwestern Iran. He lives down here in Shiraz. These are just a few images of Shiraz, of the nicer historical parts of Shiraz, famous for its gardens and some palaces, famous also for certain mosques, of course, the interior of Notre Dame outside. Hafiz is primarily known for his diwan, a collection of his lyric poetry, ghazal, which includes about 500 poems, which he's supposed to have written over the period of about 50 years. Let me show you, I have some. These are some of the illustrations, 18th, 19th century illustrations from the Indian subcontinent of his poetry. You can see here there's apparently some wine drinking going on. It's not terribly, is it visible? And somebody's playing a flute here, and there's a woman dancing here. And this is supposed to be Hafiz here being sort of given a cup of wine by a young lady. Hafiz is oftentimes seen as sort of the peak of lyric poetry in Persian literature, and of course today he is the most beloved poet in modern Iran. His tomb is extremely well frequented, there's loads of visitors. This is his tomb in Shiraz, which is also very impressive, sort of during night time. Hafiz has been studied in different places over several hundred years, in the Indian subcontinent, in Iran, or the Persian world itself, as well, of course, in Europe, where he has been, or where he was studied from the 18th century onwards, most notably by people like Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the famous German poet. He's also, with regard to his poetry, considered as a master, or perhaps even the master, of ambiguity, and that's related to the fact that most people fail to detect an underlying theme that connects the subsequent verses of his poetry. Most people believe that his the verses of his poems, are tied together by rhyme rather than thematically. The very famous scholar of Persian literature and mysticism, Arthur Arbery, famously called his work, or characterized it as a polyphony, i.e. that he's simultaneously using different themes and combining them. Overall, however, certain obvious central themes can be detected in his poetry. He puts a lot of emphasis on sincerity, there's a lot of social criticism in his poetry, and there is a lot of reference to love, the topic of today's talk. In general, Hafiz's poetry also becomes complicated by his outlook, and that is that he does not differentiate specifically between the worldly and the spiritual realms. He sees the material and the non-material realms as one, as united or intertwined, and he constantly switches between the worldly and the spiritual or the non-material kind of realm. It is, for that reason, oftentimes impossible to differentiate or disentangle the two, the material and the non-material, in Hafiz's poetry. And as a result of that, there are many different levels of meaning on which Hafiz can be read. There's a literal reading of his poetry. There are people who read it in a metaphorical manner or sense. There are people who read it in this physical or spiritual meaning. And of course, as a result of that, there's also many different interpretations to each of his verse. With regard to love specifically, this viewpoint of perceiving the material and the non-material world as one also applies to the theme of love. His references to love, when we analyze them, there's very little distinction that we can make out between the love for God and the love for human beings. An example here. So he says, for example, the parrot of my heart is constantly madly enarmored and lovesick like a nightingale in a cage because of the sweet talk and the eyes of the beloved. His hair is a trap and his mole the bait in this trap. In the hope of attaining the bait, I fell into the trap of the beloved. So he seems to be referring to the beloved. The beloved here obviously being God, but he refers to God as, to his eyes and to his hair and to his mole and so forth. His idea is that divine beauty is manifested everywhere in the material world. And this it doesn't appear to have been a very radical viewpoint at the time. Most people today believe that during Hafiz's time, it was a widespread notion to assume that divine beauty is manifested in everyday life in the material world, and in particular that human beings could be seen as theophanies, visible manifestations of the divine. In other words, that human beings could be symbols of divine beauty, could manifest divine beauty. And as a result of that, they could be seen as a bridge to divine beauty, to contemplating and perceiving divine beauty. So by adoring a human being as a divine manifestation, one would, by extension, of course, adore God himself. Hafiz's poetry often takes on human form when he talks about the divine beloved. He talks about the Sawi, the cupbearer, who is of course not just a cupbearer, but also is somebody who brings in the wine, a metaphor for love, and of course that therefore is the divine beloved as well. He talks about other figures, the tavern keeper, who likewise can be the divine beloved or God. He talks about other figures such as young Zoroastrian or Christian boys who would work as cupbearers in taverns, in wine taverns, and also can be read at times as sort of manifestations of divine beauty or as metaphors for God. This is related to a concept called Shahid Bazi. Some people have also called it Nazar Bazi, or in Arabic it's called Nazar ila al-Murd, the contemplating of the beardless youth, if you like. This is a practice at the time seemingly very common amongst mystically inclined Muslims, Sufis at the time, and it consisted of the contemplation of divine beauty through human beauty. So he would be contemplating, he would have a beholder, and he would contemplate a beautiful young boy, a female, who he believed would be a manifestation of divine beauty, a shahid, a witness of divine beauty, and in this sense this would be a bridge to sort of divine beauty. Of course, one wasn't supposed to become distracted by the human being from divine beauty, and most people who practiced this kind of shahid qazi assert on many occasions that their intentions are chaste and pure and there are no carnal desires involved. In many other poems, especially panegyric poetry of Hafiz, that is poetry that is composed in praise of a ruler or an important person, Hafiz at the surface praises, well, this human being, this ruler or this wazir or important figure, but actually addresses God through this. So he uses panegyric poetry as expressing sort of a deeper spiritual meaning. And beyond that, it's also clear from Hafiz's poetry that love for existence as a whole, for your fellow man, is a very important aspect. So what are some of the main characteristics of love in Hafiz's poetry? Now, this is of course not going to be a comprehensive overview because there could be several books written about that, but what are some of the main characteristics of love that we find in Hafiz? Well, for a start, he strongly emphasizes that one needs preparation. So he says, for example, Hafiz, everyone who is unprepared for love but desires union, put on the dress of Hajj without performing ritual ablution. So he put on the dress of Hajj without actually performing a ritual ablution. In other words, he's not prepared for love. In other words, he needs the ritual ablution, a sign of purity, to embark on the path of love. Of course, he means inner purity here. So you need, metaphorically speaking, about the inner purity, and one needs to be purified inside to be prepared for love. Another verse which alludes to this reads, "The path of love, even though it is a place of ambush full of archers, whoever goes along it prepared will evade the enemy." So one needs to be prepared, one needs to be purified inside. And in Hafiz poetry, one needs to be fully committed. Puts a lot of emphasis on full commitment. There's no gray areas. Well, it's either out or in. His emphasis on sincerity in his poetry oftentimes alludes to the fact that a lot of people are semi-committed Sufis, semi-committed mystics who are not fully committed to this. And for him, commitment is crucial. So preparation can be understood as inner purity as well as full commitment to the cause. And so since love is all-consuming, the extent of this commitment, of course, goes all the way to the readiness that one has to sacrifice oneself for the beloved in a spiritual sense. Love is also, in Hafiz poetry, well above and beyond the rational faculties of man. He says, for example, "You who attempt to learn about the signs of love by intellect, I fear you will not completely understand those points." Or he says, in another verse, and I have a reading here in Persian, which I would like to show you. Let's listen to the Persian first of all, please.
حریم عشق را درگه بسی بالاتر از عقل است، کسی آن آستان بوسد که جان در آستین دارد.
So he says here, let me see. The sanctuary of love is a realm many times above reason. Whoever reaches this realm is ready to sacrifice his life. So that refers to sort of the commitment that one has to spiritually sacrifice life for the beloved. In relation to this, so love being sort of well above the rational faculties of man, love can also not be expressed by words. Talk about love cannot be expressed by a tongue, cupbearer, pour wine, and keep communication to essential aspects. So here we have, of course, sort of in the first line, in the first half of the verse, the idea that love cannot be expressed by tongue, cannot be properly expressed. The cupbearer, of course, again, is the divine beloved who pours wine, metaphorically speaking, for love. Wine is oftentimes a metaphor for love in Hafiz poetry. And so rather than talking, just pour the wine and I become intoxicated by love, and keep the communication between us to the essential points. That is to say, while love cannot be expressed by tongue, there is of course communication between the lover, Hafiz, and the beloved. Oftentimes he refers to signs and codes that are used in this sense of communication between the two. And this idea that love is beyond words, beyond expression, also manifests itself in Hafiz poetry in the sense that he speaks out against people who go around publicly and talk about their love for God and their sort of grandiose, boastful kind of claims about their ecstatic states and so forth. He's very critical of those kind of people. Now you might wonder how he can sort of reconcile that with his own poetry talking about love. But poetry, of course, because of its elusiveness and ambiguity, is both supposed to reveal but also to conceal. So it's sort of a different level, and of course he might see himself slightly different in that. In any case, love is not only beyond the rational faculties of man, but it actually reverses many of the worldly principles. The worldly standards are reversed. What is highly regarded in this world is low, and vice versa, he says. And let me just see whether we can find the Persian here as well, because I have here you go.
عالم از ناله عشاق مبادا.
Sorry, that's the wrong verse. Apologies. Here we go.
عجب علمیست علم هیئت عشق که چرخ هشتمش هفتم زمین است.
So he says, what a wondrous, strange science, the science of love, where the eighth heaven is in fact the seventh earth. Note that he refers to science in the sense of also the eight heavens, sort of astrology. The eight heavens, of course, refers to Ptolemy's planetary model of 8 planetary spheres. But in fact, the highest of those levels of those planetary spheres is in fact the lowest, sort of the lowest level of the Earth, the very lowest level. So he's seemingly saying everything is reversed. Everything that is considered, or everybody who's considered powerful or wealthy or important, is actually the opposite end of. Worldly standards are reversed. There are also, of course, limitations to love between man and God. In Hafiz, man is eventually unable to love God properly, fully, to reach him fully, of course, in an essential way, or to love him directly, and he needs oftentimes this human manifestation as a filter as well, as to filter out sort of the essential divinity. For that reason, because human manifestations can also be seen like idols, Hafiz oftentimes also talks about idols in this sense, because it's far away from loving God in an essential way. So these days, passion for idols is my faith. The grief of this provides the happiness of my grievous heart. And idols oftentimes are connected to assumptions, to our own assumptions based on our own thinking. So Hafiz thinks that we cannot arrive at God in a proper sense, we cannot love Him in a proper sense because we make assumptions. We will never get there in a state of certainty, as he said. On the path of love, nobody has reached the intimate, in other words, God, in a state of certainty. Everybody makes assumptions on the basis of one's thinking. So these assumptions become like idols or veils and barriers to further progress. And Hafiz is very much aware of the limitations of his love for God. And love is also an imprisonment, a trap, as we have seen in the first verse we looked at, where he says, "The parrot of my heart is constantly man enamored and loves it like a nightingale in a cage." and later refers, of course, to the trap of the lover. So it's also an imprisonment in a sense. Love is also dangerous in Hafez's poetry. It's a dangerous path to go along. We saw the verse about it being a place of ambush full of archers, for example. He also has a very famous verse which he just read.
شیر در بادیه عشق تو روباه شود آه از این راه که در وی خطری نیست که نیست.
So he says, in the wilderness of your love, the lion turns into a fox, because there's no danger that does not exist in it, in the wilderness of love. So it turns from a bold, fearless, offensive animal represented by the lion, it turns into a timid, fearful but wily creature, i.e. a fox. So you adjust on the path of love because of all of those dangers, because there's no danger that does not exist on the path of love, because love is capricious, its states change constantly, and the beloved can turn away. There's always separation. The beloved will turn away his face, and the lover will be left in a state of grievance and affliction. So it's never a constant, and one has always to be aware of that. And the beloved, the divine beloved, can also be even unjust or selfish, or again, capricious. Hafez says, if the lightning of love burns the harvest of the wool bearers, then that's that. If a powerful king mistreats a beggar, then that's that. The game of love you have to endure, O strong heart. If there's affliction, then that's that. And if there's injustice, then that's that. So if there's affliction, if there's injustice, you just have to endure it. Of course, the powerful king refers to God as he mistreats a lover, a beggar of his. The lightning of love, of course, is also sent down by God. And it is affliction that is a central theme of Hafez's depiction of love. Affliction, suffering, or grief are central to his poetry. They, in many ways, define it. There is, of course, intoxication. There is elation whenever one is in the presence of the beloved, whenever one becomes intoxicated by the wine of love. But there's also much affliction, and one has to endure that. In fact, Hafez considers grief or affliction or suffering because the beloved has turned away, or one is in a state of separation. He considers this grief a crucial ingredient for the advancement of somebody on a mystical path. It helps and facilitates self-purification, and of course it also facilitates eventually self-sacrifice that I've mentioned is an important aspect of his path. Love is a path with nothing besides it. On it there's no other choice but giving up one's life, he says. And interestingly enough, despite this, despite the affliction and the grief and the suffering, love is actually depicted in many ways as a remedy to our oftentimes depressing circumstances. Hafez says, Do not get depressed about the world and keep my advice in mind, for I only remember this gentle love since embarking on the path. So since embarking on the path of love, I am absorbed with love, and it keeps me from, or it helps me in this depressing world. He also says, how lucky I am that in this drought of faithfulness, love is this ecstatic, intoxicated musician constantly following me. So in this drought, in this dryness, in this lack of faithfulness, in which nobody is faithful to another, nobody has loyalty to another, love is this joyful, jovial, intoxicated musician who is following him around everywhere. And the benefit of love is not just for the lover, it also helps others. In many ways, Hafiz sees that it is in the way that love sustains the world. He says very famously, the world should never be devoid of the wailing of the lovers, because the wailing, it has pleasant melodies and refreshes the atmosphere with joy. So in fact, the wailing, i.e. the sounds that the lovers make because of their grief and their suffering, are like fresh air to creation. They give joy and pleasant melodies to creation. And of course we've seen also this previous verse where he says that the passion for the idols is the happiness of his grievous heart. So in Hafiz's mind, oftentimes happiness and sadness are actually reversed in meaning. Grief and affliction are positive. Only man oftentimes does not understand that. Finally, love is all-encompassing, and everybody really searches for love. He says, everybody's searching for the lover, whether sober or drunk. Love exists everywhere, whether in the mosque or the pagan shrine. So love transcends religious traditions. It can be found in mosques as well as pagan shrines, depending on, of course, the lover. And whether somebody consciously or subconsciously searches the lover, in the end we are all searching for the lover in one way or another. So love is everywhere, even in the famous wine tavern. In the presence of love, there is no difference between a Sufi convent and a tavern, i.e. a wine tavern. Wherever it is present, there is the radiance of the beloved. So again, love has no limits. It is everywhere. It is in many ways, in his thought, the driving force behind the whole universe and existence. Above also this world and the next world. Beggar of the alley, you are in no need of the 8 paradises. Prisoner of love, you are free of both worlds. In other words, you're free of this world as well as the next world, because love is above that. And really, he seems to imply at times that there's nothing really that exists other than love. He says, I offered both worlds to the heart of the experienced mystic, i.e. this world and the next world, but he regarded everything except your love, that is divine love, as annihilated.